Shabbos. Good to see everybody. Turn off, if someone has a phone, turn it off so we aren't interrupted. This morning, we're delighted to welcome Professor Arthur Green, who is the head of the rabbinical school at the Boston Hebrew College, it used to be called.
Is that Hebrew College? Yeah.
Professor Emeritus at the Brandeis University, a dear friend, one of my rabbis, one of my teachers, and the leading scholar of Hasidism, Jewish mysticism in the world. His books are available for sale in the gift shop. Not Shabbos, of course, but when you come back, I'd recommend the first one, read the newest one, which is called Judaism's 10 Best Ideas.
It's very short. You can go on to something else from that.
Right. And then work your way back to his theological books. It's called Seek My Face, Speak My Name, which is his theology, his interpretation of Judaism. And then if you have real courage, is the short book called Radical Judaism. And then if you're really in a scholarly mood, take out your highlighter and get the book called Tormented Master, which is his biography of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Now last night some of us were together and we had a wonderful chance to begin learning with Professor Green. This morning you're going to have 3 chances. You ready? So this morning we will share Torah study together. After this Torah study, there's several services in the building. There's a service in the main sanctuary with a lovely young man having his bar mitzvah. In the Sher Lapati Chapel, the Neshama Minyan is meeting, which is musical, spiritual, and fun. And Rabbi Green will be speaking there several times. That's where he's going to be hanging out. And then following lunch, which is lasagna, we're going to join Professor Green in Sher Lapati for a continuation of our conversation. Okay, so whole morning of studying really good Torah. Come in. Rachel, take a seat there.
You told me you had a rabbi study group Shabbos morning. I pictured 12 people around a table, maybe 20.
Listen, I do my best to discourage these people. This
is what you call a shtickle rabbi study group.
Don't come to shul, stay home. What can I do? It's a terrible problem. Come on. Come on. Phil, come. Okay? All right, there we go. Michelle, you got a plate? Yeah, got a plate? Okay. Let's backtrack just a little bit from where we were last night. And let me ask you the sort of klutz kasha, the obvious question. Okay?
Which of us is the klutz?
No. That's very clear. The question I want to ask is there a Hasidic way of reading Torah? And I'll ask it more specifically. If a misnagid, an anti-Hasidic Jew, and a Chassid are each learning Parsha Shavua, let's take this one, for example, Yitro. How would they learn it differently?
Yes, wonderful. Good Shabbos, everybody. Wonderful to be here. The Hasidic interpreters begin again and again with what does this Parsha have to say to us? It's very nice what it says in the Torah, but Maida Hava, Masha Haya, what happened already. But the Torah is called Torah, which means teaching, which means it's supposed to teach us something. So what does this Parsha have to say to us today in our own language? And they begin the interpretation from there. So the quest for relevance is very central to the Hasidic enterprise. And it's mostly about spiritual relevance. It's mostly not what does it have to say about the political situation, what does it have to say about the world in which we live, but what does it have to say about the person who is seeking to stand in God's presence, who is seeking to make his life more spiritually open, more spiritually rich. And then they go from there to a kind of religious insight into the Parsha. But it's always chidush. Chidush is very important. Now, chidush in Hebrew and then in Yiddish means something new, a new insight, something you never saw before. Hasidism is a kind of renaissance of Midrash, because it wants to take a familiar verse and make you say, wow, I never saw it that way before. And that wow moment is a little bit like the slap of the Zen master. It sort of wakes you up and puts you into another mode of consciousness. I never thought of that. And that's a moment of opening the mind. So you see they're constantly doing that, trying trying to get some new and transformative insight, but it's always an insight into your own spiritual life or how we can live today. And now the Chassid will say, here's something unfair. The Chassid will say about the Misnagid, I do the mitzvahs because the Rabbi Shalom loves me and the Rabbi Shalom commanded me, and I love the Rabbi Shalom, I do them in response. The Misnagid does the mitzvahs because it says the Shulchan Aruch you have to. It says in the law code that you have to. Now that's unfair. That's unfair. The Chassid sort of putting the Misnagid down. The Misnagid would probably say something parallel and nasty about the Chassid too, but that's another story.
Yeah. You guys want to come in? We have no room, but you can come in. Take a
We
chair.
don't-
Bring a chair out there.
We don't have a closed circuit TV out there yet, huh? This is
Bring a chair. How can bring? Ami, there's room. Bring chairs. Come on. Yeah. Come over here. Bring them over here. Come on. We'll just talk really loud. Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to see you.
Forgive them. Okay, we got chairs.
they know what they do.
Have a lap. A lap and a chair. Bring a chair. Thanks. You got a chair? Squeeze in the back. Get a chair. We got chairs. Chairs I got. It's a happy shul that has more Jews than chairs. Unfortunately, the state of the Jewish people is the other way around. Chair, come on. Take a chair. Okay. Come on in, Red. Come in. We have room. Everybody squeeze over. Mr. Rabbi gets a chair. Ms. Murray gets a chair. Find his face.
Good Shabbos.
You guys bring some chairs and come sit. It's okay, Rabbi. Get a chair. Come
Okay.
All right, here we go. All right, now I'm going to ask even a klutzier kasha, because I want to probe this just a little bit. So when I see someone who calls himself Hasidic, I see a person who is ferociously observant of law, ferociously observant of custom, who has separated himself from the world that I live in, black coats and fuzzy hats and funny socks. And you said that the way that a chassid begins his reading of Torah is to ask, what does it say to me? So, for just a moment, so obviously what I'm seeing on the outside is not what's going on the inside. What's going on the inside?
From the point of view, forgive me, my voice is going, I'm afraid. That's not going to sound great. I can't help it. From the point of view of early Hasidism, the period of the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid, their disciples, you have never met a Hasid. Hasidism went through a long history. It's been around for 250 years. And it's been through 4 periods of history, each of which has transformed it quite completely. Hasidism began as a mostly youth movement, young people around the Maggid's table, guys in their 20s, 30s, and rebellious against the dry legalism of the Misnagdim. The great enemy of Hasidism's first 30 years was what it called, using a verse from Isaiah, mitzvat anashim melumada, which means learned, rote, boring religious behavior. That was the enemy. And they were trying to breathe life back into it. Hasidism was a revival movement in its beginning. Nachman of Bratslav says, Jews are like knishes. They're all the same, but I prefer the hot ones to the cold ones. It was like, you ever try a cold knish? It bringing the life.
You're going to see this on Valley Vet Shalom.
bringing the life back in. The difference, understand the difference between a reform movement and a revival movement. A reform movement says the forms are outdated, we have to change the forms. We have to bring in organ music, we have to have a nice responsive reading in German or English that will make it relevant, changing the forms. Revival movement says, give me that old-time religion. The old-time religion is fine, but the spirit has gone out of it. We have to bring fire, we have to bring life back into it. So Hasidism is a revival. The Misnagdim, remember, persecuted the Hasidim. They were excommunicated for the first 30 years. The great rabbis of the day were fiercely opposed. What happened? 1810, Napoleon invades Eastern Europe. Even though he had betrayed the French Revolution, he brings the ideas of the French Revolution along with him. Suddenly, the rabbis and the Hasidim see a much more dangerous enemy on the horizon, called modernity, called Haskalah. The rabbis look around and they say, you know, these Hasidim aren't so bad after all. They're keeping mitzvahs, they're living within the tradition. Let's make common cause with them to fight modernity. The Hasidim were so relieved they wouldn't be persecuted anymore. They agreed to be the sort of Spitzmesser, the point of the knife in the battle against modernity. So for the next 60, 70 years, Hasidism grows, the rabbinate supports it. Hasidism becomes the dominant movement in Eastern European Jewish life, outside of Lithuania, where it failed. But for anybody who wasn't really a Litvak, Hasidism more or less took over Jewish life and became progressively more observant, more identified with very strict observance. In the days of the Baal Shem Tov, that wasn't the case. He was easy on certain things. Certainly anything that punished the self, anything that brought too much guilt upon you, the Baal Shem Tov was completely opposed to. But Hasidism moved to the right because it made common cause with the rabbinate. Then the third period happens after 1881, when the Great Emigration begins and urbanization begins, and Hasidism declines rapidly. By the 20th century, by after World War I, if you were a Hasid and your kids were Mizrahi, you were lucky. Usually your kids were socialists or communists or Zionists or something like that. My father's family were Ger and Alexander Hasidim from Shtetlach. They moved to Lodz in the 1890s. In Lodz, the great industrial town, the kids lost their religion and became Jewish leftists. That's what happened. So that was continuing down to 1939. Hasidism was in decline. It was fighting modernity as much as it could. It was picking up some of the techniques of modernity. It had learned about women's education, for example, in the Beis Yaakov movement. It had learned about educational methods in some ways. It was trying, but it couldn't keep up with modernity. It was on the way down. When Hasidism was on the way down, by the way, it was the first time that some non-Hasidim, including Martin Buber and Hillel Zeitlin and others, said, you know, there's some good ideas in Hasidism we should be learning from. Because the fierce battle was over. Hasidism, of course, was almost completely destroyed in the war. The Hasidim were the most hapless victims, least able to resist other than spiritually. And there was nothing left, except of the Hasidim who had emigrated to Eretz Yisrael. There was a very extreme, mostly Hungarian Hasidism that was centered in Eretz Yisrael. The most amazing period in the history of Hasidism was the period after 1945, when these people, all of whom had stopped observing during the war because you couldn't, came back in the DP camps. They met, married, and started having children. That act of faith to rebuild their community after the war was just incredible. It was one of the great testimonies to the power of faith, I think, in the modern world. And they rebuilt in a more extreme way, partly to defy Hitler, and partly because they were very scared. When you lived in a town in Galicia, you knew, all right, the Goyim over there, they might be anti-Semites, but your kids weren't going to be tempted to live their life. But if you live in Brooklyn, a cheeseburger is only one subway ride away for any of your kids. That's the way it is. And so they are so frightened of the outside world, they try to build the walls higher and higher and higher, and that's what they're about. Does the original spirit of revivalist, creative, interesting Hasidism still exist among them? The answer is in pockets. Sometimes you can still find it. You read something by the Slonim Rebbe, the Nesiva Sholem, who died in Jerusalem in the 1980s, I think, and you can see he's still got some of it. Here and there you can find it, but it's hard because it's buried under a lot of extremism, xenophobia, fear of the outside world, fear of people like us. They're terrified of people like us. We're the most dangerous, especially me, because I sort of make a claim to Hasidism. I read the same books they read. So how come I come up with such different conclusions? And they don't study very much Hasidism anymore. They're so busy studying halacha that there's not much learning of Hasidism except in a few exceptional places like Breslov. They still learn Rabbi Nachman's teachings. But most of them, they all own the Hasidic books, but I can't say they're much inspired by them anymore. They're too busy being super frum and more frum than the Hasidic group next door. I have almost no contact with the Hasidic community. I'm really interested in Hasidism in the 18th century. Hasidism in the 21st century, I watch the news about it, but that's not where my roots are.
So if we think about, as a kid, and I met Hasid, met Chabad, for example, we think about Hasidism, one of the factors in Hasidic religious practice is joy.
Yes.
Seems
That's where I begin the 10 ideas, by the way.
right.
First idea is joy, because that's influenced by Hasidism.
So what is the role of joy in Hasidic spirituality?
That's what God wants of you. God wants of you simcha shel mitzvah. You should do the mitzvot as an act of joy. As an act of joy, because you do them out of love. And if there is something that makes my beloved happy, then I want to do it, and I fill myself with it. In that first chapter, I tell this little story. About a friend of the Baal Shem Tov. His name was Rabbi Margulies. He was an old man, and he was about to do the mitzvah of baking matzahs Erev Pesach. Matzahs Erev Pesach, the matzot mitzvah, the matzahs you're going to use for the Seder, were baked Erev Pesach amid singing and joy. It was a very celebratory thing. But for kosher matzahs, you need something called mayim shalanu. Doesn't mean our water, mayim shalanu, but mayim shalanu means the water has to be still overnight. You have to draw the water the day before, leave it overnight so the water is very still, and therefore it won't cause any suspicion of chametz, any suspicion of stirring up leaven when you mix it with the flour. So Rabbi Margulies is an old man. He has 2 buckets over his neck, and he goes down to the town river and he fills them up, and he's carrying this yoke on his neck. And a guy comes along with a horse and wagon and says, "Rabbi, let me give you a ride. I see you're struggling here." And he says, "I have the joy of doing this mitzvah once a year. You want me to give it away to a horse?" So that's the kind of, it's a privilege to do a mitzvah. And it's a privilege that makes you happy. And that's what Judaism is supposed to be about from that Hasidic point of view. What it's not supposed to be about is feeling guilty and burdened and counting how many things you did wrong. The Baal Shem Tov says very clearly, the evil one wants to trip you up on some little mitzvah, wants you to forget to daven mincha, or wants you to eat something that maybe wasn't kosher, and then make you feel so guilty about it that you're afraid to daven, you're afraid to come to God, you're so obsessed with it. He says if you commit a transgression, regret it immediately and go back to serving God in joy. Don't let it burden you. That was the essential, that was what the Baal Shem Tov became famous for. Kabbalah in the 18th century, Kabbalah in the Baal Shem Tov's time, became identified with very severe asceticism. We don't know much about that. We like to think, Judaism isn't an ascetic tradition. But in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, you can find books on how to do tshuva. How many times you fast, how many days you have to fast in a row, and beating yourself, whipping yourself. And what they call this wonderful punishment in Poland called Gilgul Sheleg, which is rolling in the snow in order to punish the body. And for each sin, they'll list for each sin how many times you have to do each of these things. And the Baal Shem Tov taught you could have a rich Jewish spiritual life without any of that. That's a temptation. Get rid of it. One of the few documents we have of him is a letter to his leading disciple, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, I mentioned last night. He says, "I see you're still doing those things, and I command you in the name of all the saints and the angels, stop it." And then he says, he quotes a verse from Isaiah, which we know because it's the Yom Kippur Haftorah. He says, "Mi besarcha al tit alam." Don't run away from your own flesh. Of course, in the verse it means don't run away from your own people. But he's saying don't run away from your own flesh. And that's I love Hasidism because there's something healthy about that. There is something self-accepting about it. And that's one of the reasons I was attracted to the Baal Shem Tov and my friend who I was talking about last night, the Marinayim. Because I think there is a healthy attitude toward religious life combined with a very deep spirituality.
So let's move to the heart of the matter. When a Chassid thinks about God, it's there's a revolution in that as well. There's a different notion of God than you might find in a more conventional.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
So
absolutely.
Tell us what Hasidic theology is like.
It is not simple because it's based on a very long tradition of Jewish mysticism, which the Hasidim then try to simplify to make accessible to ordinary people. But I would say, briefly, the Baal Shem Tov's great insight that founded Hasidism is simply that there is no place or no moment or no event that is not filled to the brim with the presence of God if you know how to see it. The spiritual work is the work of opening your eyes to see God everywhere. Merlo chol haaretz kivodo, the Isaiah line that we say in Kedusha, becomes the kind of watchword in Hasidism. And that means everything. It means not only mitzvahs and not only the halacha and not only studying Talmud, but it means when you're involved in an ordinary conversation in the marketplace, you also have to see the divine presence is there. Even in evil, the divine presence is there. Evil is a cover, but the evil couldn't exist if the divine presence didn't give it life. So everything is there. The Baal Shem Tov quotes a line from the Song of the Sea. Erdof asiga chalek amar oyev erdof asiga chalek shalal. 5 words in a row beginning with Aleph. And he says, these words are the words of the wicked Egyptians. And he says, that's because Alufo Shel Olam, the cosmic one, is there even in their words. So, number one, everything contains the presence of God, and our job is to find it even in the most unlikely places. Hasidism becomes a life, this early Hasidism, becomes a life of a kind of spiritual adventure, because you have to look for God in the places where it's hardest to find God. Your job is to raise up sparks. The sparks of divine light have been scattered everywhere. You all probably know that story. The vessels broke when the light was being sent into the world. The sparks scattered everywhere, and your job is to find those sparks and bring them back to God. Now, God has done us the favor of giving us a Torah which teaches us how to do that. I would say the tradition has done us that favor, because I'm not a literal believer in divine authorship. The tradition has given us this way of doing that sacred work, which is finding God everywhere. If God is everywhere, then the name Yud He Vav He, which I talked about last night, the name Yud He Vav He, which is the name of God, which really means being or existence, Havaya, existence, and Yud He Vav He are the same letters just switched around. They say that constantly. They tell you that Hateva, nature, is the same gematria that has the numerical equivalent of the word Elohim, because God is hidden within nature. So they're always trying to find a way to tell you that the natural world is the supernatural world. If you know how to see it, if you know how to discover it. So it's a journey of discovery, I would say. The relationship of God and world is not the same as conventional religion. In conventional Western religion, God is the creator, God is other than the world, God creates the world, the power of God is to be seen in the world, but world and God are quite separate. In the Hasidic imagination, because God is everywhere, the world, with its multiplicity, is an outer perception. But there's an inner perception where there is nothing but the one, where there's nothing but God. So even though God did create the world, God created the world as a cover of his own self. And when you penetrate that cover, you find that divine presence is everywhere. Now, they play games. They're cautious about that, because they have heard that to be completely pantheistic is dangerous. And they know they could be condemned for that. In the early charamot, in the early excommunications of the Hasidim, they're accused of things like that. So they try to hide pantheism inside theism. They still daven from the same siddur, more or less. And the siddur, which is much older than Hasidism, seems to be talking about the fellow in the sky kind of God. And they're a popular movement. They want to convey popular piety, but they convey it and they undercut it. So there's a Hasidic story about a guy who comes into the synagogue and says, Rabbi Shalom, Lord of the world, I don't remember any of the davening. I only had a couple years of cheder. All I remember is the alphabet. But Rabbi Shalom, you know all the words. So I'll give you the letters and you make the words. And he prays Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet. Now that's a Hasidic folk story. But that's a Hasidic folk story that masks the profound Hasidic idea that the world is created by the letters. God is Alufo Shel Olam. God is the cosmic Aleph. But that Aleph is hidden inside a bet. A bet is the beginning of duality. That's why the Torah begins with the letter bet, not the letter Aleph. Because as soon as the world is created, there are two. Bet means two. So there's heaven and earth, there's God and world, there's male and female, duality, and then duality goes on and on and on, and we get this multifarious universe until you get down to Tav. And Tav, they say, is Tav Tichye, Tav Tamut. The Tav means because the Tav is the second person future, so you always have to make a moral choice. You go from Alufo Shel Olam down to the Tav, which is the place where you have to stand before choices in life. So that's a kind of profound idea that the world is the hitlabshuta otiyot. The world is the, how do you say that in English? The world is God dressed in the garb of letters. It's the one dressed in the garb of multiplicity. So there you have a profound teaching, and at the same time, this little folk story, Rabbi Shalom, I give you the letters. You understand? They try to take profound ideas and make them accessible to ordinary Jews.
So let's pursue this a moment. Let's go. In the book Speak My Name, you set out a theology which then you summarize in the 10 best ideas.
Yes.
Where you gave us a drasha on the Shema.
Oh, yes.
Right? So, when we were little kids, we learned Shema. Shema Yisrael, listen up, Jews. Adonai Eloheinu, whatever that means. Adonai Echad, there's one God, not two, not three, not four, not five. But in that book, you did a midrash, which I take it as a Hasidic way of reading the Shema, which opens up a whole different world.
That's
of
right.
How one thinks about God. So how does a Chassid do the Shema?
Well, what I'll give you is half a chassid and half what I do, okay?
Sure. That's close enough for me.
Because I can't give you footnotes for all of this. I've developed it myself. I've been writing a commentary on the Siddur for many years based on my study of Hasidism.
All right, so everyone all together go, no.
We have to decide which Siddur to publish it with, and so it'll be a while. All right. At the center of the Siddur is something that's not a prayer. The Shema is not a prayer. Prayers are addressed to God. Prayers all day long we say, Baruch Atah, Baruch Atah. We address God as a you. What does it mean to address God as a you? Do I think there's somebody there who is listening in the simple sense? No, I don't. I don't. I wrote an essay on prayer once. This is a digression. I wrote an essay on prayer once where I talked about the theory of prayer of the chassid in the telephone booth. In those days, there were telephone booths. You'll forgive me. I said, our friend the chassid is running around Grand Central Station. It's about 6 o'clock at night in the middle of the fall or spring, and he realized he hasn't davened mincha yet. So he's embarrassed to just stand up in the middle of Grand Central Station and daven mincha. He sees a bay of telephones, picks up a phone, says, right? Nowadays, you'd say it without the bay of phones. He takes his phone out of his pocket and starts talking, like all these other crazy-looking people who are talking into their phones. The validity of prayer does not depend on the question, is there anybody on the other end of the line? You understand? Prayer is not like a telephone conversation. Is anybody there? If nobody is there, you must be crazy. That's not the point. That's not the point. Prayer is as much about listening as it is about speaking. God is present in the act of prayer, not because there's somebody listening. My favorite, I'm going to get back to the Shema. My very favorite Hasidic teaching on prayer is a one-liner, two-liner, from Reb Pinchas Koretz. Reb Pinchas of Koretz was a friend of the Baal Shem Tov. He said, I did a book, the first book I ever did was a little book called Your Word is Fire, which was Hasidic interpretations of prayer. My very favorite one was this, 2 lines. He says, I couldn't believe when I saw it. I'll say it in Hebrew, in very Hasidic Hebrew. Ha'olam svurin shemitparalin lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu ve'eino ken. People think you pray to God, and that's not the case. Ela hatfilah hi etzem Elohut mamash. But prayer itself is of the divine essence. The act of prayer is a divine act. It's not, is there somebody listening on the other end of the phone, but what have you done in opening your heart? What this turning inward, this bringing out your feelings, this joining in a chorus of human emotions to open yourself to God, the act of making yourself vulnerable, which prayer requires, those are holy acts. God is present in those acts. So when we say atah, and I don't think there's somebody up there in the sky listening, what do I mean? So the midrash on the word atah goes like this. Aleph and Tav, the beginning and end of the alphabet. We just said it. By the way, in the New Testament, Jesus says, I am Alpha and Omega. Same thing, Alpha and Omega in the Greek alphabet. Aleph to Tav means everything in the world, because everything is created by the letters from Aleph to Tav. So the totality of being, Havaya, existence, is Aleph to Tav. But when you have Aleph and Tav, all you get is Et. Et is the divine, is the direct object. You have objective existence. You take the Hey, which stands for God's name, Hashem, and add it to Aleph and Tav and get Atah. You transform Et into Atah. I'm sorry for the feminists, it's not At, but you transform the Et into Atah, and you make God into a thou. We do that. We do that. Am I saying religion is just projection? Take the just out of that sentence. What I like to say is, God creates us in the divine image, and we are obliged to return the favor. Chew on that one for a minute. God creates us in the divine image, and we are obliged to return the favor. We make God into a person because we need somebody to talk to. It's very hard for us to talk to the oneness of being, or the essence of existence, or the totality of everything that was, is, and will be. So we take that Et and make it into an Atah, so we can say, but the Shema has no Atah. The Shema is not addressed to God. Why? The Shema is not addressed to God. Because in that moment of the Shema, there is no separation. That's the moment, what the Zohar calls the Yichuda Ila'ah, the upper unity. There is only one at that moment. There is no other, there is no separation. Therefore, we can't talk to God, because we are part of that oneness. When we say Hashem Echad, we enter into that oneness. So we say to the people, now Yisrael, I said already last night, my Yisrael is in tefillah, and prayer is universalized. Yisrael means all you who are wrestling with these questions, all you who are struggling with the angel, all you who are up all night with that angel not leaving you alone and you not leaving the angel alone. So listen, strugglers, there is only one. Listen, strugglers, Adonai Eloheinu, that Yud He Vav He is right here inside us. Eloheinu, it's in us. And it's one with the universe. And there ain't nothing else. Now, how do we make the transition from dualism to monism, from 2 to 1? We live in a world where, if I'm sane, I know I'm me and you're you. And I know there are borders not to be transgressed. If I think it's all me, I'm in big psychological trouble. You better run away from me. If I think it's all you, there's no room for me, I'm also in trouble. I have to know, we live in a world of I and thou. We live in a world where separate identity is important. Then we come to that moment of the Shema where there's only one. How do we leap over it? How do we make that transition? We have been given a great gift. God has given us a great gift, I will say. And that is the gift of love. Because in loving, we can sometimes glimpse what it is to transcend those borders between self and other. In the act of love, if it's sexual, but also in great compassionate love. It happens in the love for your grandchildren, not only in the love for your spouse. There's a moment in love where we look beyond and we see through to oneness. That's why you can only come to the Shema through love. So we have Ahava Rabbah before it in the morning and Ahavat Olam before it in the evening. And you can only go out from that Shema through the gate of love. So Shema is always followed immediately by Ve'ahavta. You come into the Shema through love, which is to say you come into that unity of insight through the urging of love, through the gift of love, and then you take that moment of unity of insight. You take that moment where somewhere inside you know there is only one. There is only one. But what am I going to do with it? How am I going to apply that to people? How am I going to bring that into the world? The answer is Ve'ahavta, through love. Because loving Ve'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, you love the Lord your God, of course, has to be realized by the way you act among people. So you go into the Shema and come out of the Shema through love. So that's my partly Hasidic, partly neo-Hasidic midrash on how I understand the Shema.
Yeah, but most people understand Adonai Echad.
There's only one God.
There's one God who lives up there.
Yeah.
There's not two guys up there, or seven, or three.
What's the difference? Why is it important? You see, let me go back last night. I told you the story, which you all know, about Abraham and the idols. Yes, when you were 8 years old, you probably looked in the Torah to try to find it, and then discovered it wasn't there. Abraham smashes the idols. Terach, his father, was an idol maker, and Terach says, I have to go to the store for a minute, watch the shop, watch the idols, and Abraham goes, and he smashes all the idols except the biggest one. And he puts the axe in the biggest one's hand. Terach comes home and says, what happened to my stock? And he says, this big idol smashed all the other ones. And Terach says, oh, come on, they're just statues. And then Abraham says, aha! That's the aha moment when monotheism begins. There was a Hebrew poet, David Frischman, the same generation as Bialik, writing in the 1910 or so. He wrote a poem about this, and he said, yes, that's what we Jews did. We smashed all the idols except the biggest one. You understand? We smashed all the idols. That's just what we did. You may call that the Buddhist critique of Judaism. Okay? That's the Buddhist critique of Judaism. You smash all. So if your God is just a single idol, what have you accomplished? It's got to be more than that. If you take the biggest, say yes, Micha Mocha Ba'elim, you're the biggest one, you're the most powerful one, you've destroyed all the gods of Egypt, you are the biggest one, you are the only God who counts. Well, you've got a certain step toward maybe into monolatry, which is on the road to monotheism. But I think the journey has to go farther. Now, the most exciting teacher I ever had was Yochanan Mufs at the seminary. He was wonderful. I had the privilege of having him before he was sick. And he wrote a book on the personhood of God, which I give to my students. It's wonderful. The divine personality and how beautifully wrought the divine personality is in both biblical and rabbinic Judaism. But we went beyond that. Maimonides did not believe that God had a personality. Maimonides believed in a very abstract notion of the deity. He spends the whole first part of the guide trying to tell you all those, not only physical descriptions, but emotional descriptions of the old fellow in the sky are not real. The Kabbalists came along and had the opposite strategy for the same purpose. Maimonides said, I'm going to give you a pure notion of the deity. I'm going to say the deity doesn't walk and doesn't talk and doesn't have legs and doesn't have eyes and all those things. As Heschel used to say to me, remember in class Heschel said, God spoke to Moses saying. Does God have a larynx? Does God have a voice box? What does it mean to say God spoke? This was a Maimonidean move. The word spoke, when it's said of God, has to mean something entirely different, because we mean something in the throat right here, but God doesn't have a throat with a larynx and a voice box in it. So therefore, when you use that verb spoke about God, you must mean something entirely different. That's Maimonides' theory of homonyms. The word spoke has to mean something entirely different when applied to God. The Kabbalah, and so he gives you a pure, rarefied notion of God. Maimonides will never tell you that God loves us, because love is a human emotion. We should love God, he says all over the place. That God loves us, Maimonides is too philosophically stingy to say. The Kabbalists try to do the opposite. Instead of purifying you of all metaphors, they drown you in metaphors. Everything's a metaphor. Yes, God is a king, and God is a queen, and God is the river, and God is the sea, and God is the moon, and God is the sun, and God is and God is an esrog, and God is a matzah, and God is everything is a metaphor for God. Because if you have so many metaphors, you won't take any one of them literally and turn it into an idol. When you have only one, you turn it into an idol. That's the Jewish critique of Christianity. Yes? God is present in Jesus. Jesus is God, and that becomes idolatrous. But it can also apply to Judaism. The old fellow in the sky, right? The old bearded fellow in the sky can also be an idol. So we are beyond that. Now, I think we are on a journey that goes from polytheism to monolatry, which means there are lots of gods, but there's only one God worth worshiping, because he's the strongest. That was in the biblical time. To monotheism, ultimately going toward monism, ultimately going to there's only one. And you see that there is only one theology emerging in Hasidism. It gets buried when Hasidism becomes so busy fighting modernity. It gets buried when Hasidism comes to be identified with ultra-orthodoxy. We're at a very interesting moment in the history of world religions. Very interesting moment. We never have had real chance for dialogue with the traditions coming out of the Far East. We now meet people coming from the Hindu and Buddhist worlds and Taoist worlds who have very profound things to say. We have no legacy of anti-Semitism with them. They never oppressed Jews. They never met Jews. So in some ways, we're clean in that regard. We don't have a historical agenda like we do with Christianity in particular. They have things to say about oneness that are very interesting. Please remember, in the 10th century, when Judaism discovered Plato and Aristotle, Jewish theology was completely rewritten. Maimonides' theology is an Aristotelian theology. I believe the same thing will happen and should happen today out of our dialogue about oneness with some of the Eastern teachers. I don't think we should adopt their rituals or their language or their behavior. We have plenty of that. But in terms of our understanding of what God means, what the oneness of existence means, I think we have important things to learn from an East-West conversation. Of course, we have important things to teach in that conversation too, to give, and not just we're receiving. We have lots to give. But I think that should be a very rich conversation. It hasn't really happened yet. We were too nervous. Many of you probably read that book, The Jew and the Lotus, about the rabbi's journey to Dharamsala, yes? I'm the guy who didn't go on that trip. I went to the planning meeting, and then I had a new job. I couldn't do it. I couldn't afford the time. I didn't go. But I was both touched and disappointed, because I was ready in that conversation with a group of Tibetan monks to talk about these issues, the oneness of being and so on, as understood by Buddhist and Jewish tradition. The Dalai Lama, bless his soul, wanted to know only one thing. How have you Jews survived exile? We were exiled in 1959 and we're disappearing. You've been around for 2,000 years of exile. How have you done it? And then the conversation came to be about Tibetan-speaking summer camps and Tibet school and all the things like that, which I was much less interested in. And he was right. That's the concern of his people. He was absolutely right in doing that. But the serious theological conversation, I don't think has happened yet. It should.
Let me push you just a little bit, because as you know, if you look at Harold Schulweiss's theology, it begins and ends with an obsession with evil.
Yes.
With the brokenness of the world, with the suffering. And I'm writing this a lot, so it has a lot to do with his career as a congregational rabbi instead of becoming a college professor.
And with his generation, the Holocaust generation.
Absolutely. So in a monism, in a pantheism that identifies all of being with God, that everything is in God and of God.
He's going to pop the question, the evil question, yes.
Have to. Can't let you leave without it. So then how does one experience, understand, interpret either personal suffering, collective suffering, or radical suffering?
Well, you just said an interesting word, suffering. So let me first distinguish, as you pointed to, suffering from evil. People talk about the problem of evil, and they talk about tsunamis and cancer. I do not believe that either tsunamis or cancer are evil. They're terrible. And they show the indifference of nature to individual human beings and their lives and loves and needs. It's about the arbitrariness of the natural world. And that's just there. I do not believe in a God of particular providence who pulls the strings and controls and rewards the good children and punishes the bad children. I lost that God. I lost that God when I was about 12. Or I lost that God really when I was 18. Because I struggled for 6 years to hold on very tight. But I lost that God when I was 18. I lost that God partly because I was a kid who'd lost a parent, but I lost that God also because I remember my mother and grandmother sitting there in 1947, 48, going through the lists in the newspapers of people looking for relatives and not finding them. Some of you may be old enough to remember that time too. So I do not consider cancer or tsunamis or earthquakes or natural disasters evil. I consider them very sad. I understand that nature does not look out for us, and there's no reason why good people suffer terrible diseases or short lifespans. The very best thing about us human beings is that we love each other. We're capable of love. And that love is what makes so much pain when we lose somebody we love or when somebody we love suffers. And I know all about it. And we have to live with it. That's the way life is. It isn't easier. And so we try to find bits of beauty and bits of divine presence in those moments too. In caring for a loved one, in moments where a glimmer of light comes through in the midst of suffering, all those things are real. There is such a thing as evil. And evil is, I would say, vicious maltreatment of others by human beings, or vicious indifference to the fate of others by human beings. Those things are evil. Heschel used to say, don't ask where God was during the Holocaust, ask where man was. That's a good answer, but it's only half a good answer. Yes, human beings are responsible. But why are we that way? Why are we capable of wicked behavior? Why are we capable of doing these awful things, beheading people and all these awful, horrible, horrible things you see going on in the world? Why are human beings capable of that? Well, after lunch, I'm going to talk about evolution. And for me, the question of evil has to go to the evolution question. We evolved through natural selection. And the process of evolution, natural selection, is a wicked process. The stronger survives and the weaker dies off. And what you have to do in nature for the last several billion years is outsmart your predators and eat your prey. And if you're a deer or an elk, you grow the biggest horns to attract the best female genes, right? And you buck antlers with the other guy in the forest while the woman stands by, while the female stands by to see which one is tougher, has the better genes to survive. And so that aggressive, fierce, competitive nature is built into us. Oh, you can see two bucks bucking horns against each other on Wall Street. You can see them in Hollywood. You can see them all over the place. You can see that piece of us, that aggressive, competitive, fierce, I'm going to outsmart my foes. And that's part of our evolutionary legacy. So my outcry to God, I guess, is why did evolution have to happen that way? Why couldn't it all have happened the other way? You know, human beings, the other side of evolution, is that human beings are like ants and bees. Read E.W. Wilson, please, on ants. We are like ants and bees. We couldn't have done anything if we didn't cooperate with each other, if we didn't build a society. Right? An ant could never carry what it does and build the domicile it does if ants weren't a cooperative society. And they were able to survive because we have that part of our evolutionary legacy too. So the question is, which part will we choose? But we have that fierce, competitive, dog-eat-dog, I'm going to survive, I don't care about anybody else, piece of us as part of our evolutionary heritage. And we have to recognize that and overcome it. We have to recognize it in order to know how much to overcome it and how much to fight it. So I haven't solved the problem of evil. The problem of evil is there. And the problem of suffering is there. There is no answer, no easy answer to these things. To say the one is present in all of it makes it easier for me, I think. It makes it comforting to know that one presence is there throughout existence. And that means, of course, yes, in Hitler's soul, right, that one is there. He was born with a soul, like every other human being is born with a soul. So many of us spend much of our lives running away from our souls and building fierce shells around ourselves to keep ourselves from souls. But of course, every human being is born with a soul, is born with the image of God implanted within. And so I guess the answer is that neither the theist nor the monist has solved the problem of evil. The question is what works better for you on a day-to-day basis.
We have a minute left. It's Parsha Yitro.
Oh yes, this was going to be a conversation about the Parsha, you see, and the guy started asking tough questions.
We're going to get to that. We're going to move from here into Shul. They're going to open the Torah inlet. So, in the last moments we have, what should we be looking for in Parsha's Yitro? And where we started, which was how a Chassid reads Torah, tell me how a Chassid reads Parsha Yitro.
Exodus 19 and 20 are two of the great chapters of spiritual literature in the world. Beginning with Vatem tiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'gai kadosh, you will be a kingdom of priests for me and a holy nation. Understand, a kingdom of priests is a very interesting term, mamlechet kohanim. A priest needs a public. Whom does a priest serve? A priest is not there to be holier than others. A priest is there to serve people. So when God calls to us and says, you will be a mamlechet kohanim, that's a career of service, not a declaration of superiority. Understand that first. And the dialogue between God and Moses and the people. Is God speaking or is God thundering? Does God thunder and Moses respond, translated into words? And you'll notice the story in Exodus 19, if you follow it carefully, doesn't quite make sense. Who's going back to whom? Who's telling whom? When the Torah wants to tell a beautiful story, Joseph. It with such great drama, where to stop, where to break, and so on. The Exodus narrative. This story is staccato. First Moses is talking to God, then God is talking to Moses. All of a sudden they're talking to the people. It's as though the narrator is saying, I can't give you a film here. I can only give you a bunch of stills. And you got to put it together. In Exodus 20, right after the Ten Commandments, the people say to Moses, Daber ata imanu v'nishma'a v'al yidaber imanu Hashem pen namut. You talk to us, Mo. Don't let that one talk to us anymore. We're going to die. The Midrash says, the Talmud says, the Jews did not say that after the Ten Commandments. They said it after the first two. All we really heard from God were the first two commandments. I am God, who took you out of Egypt, and worship nothing else. No false gods. The whole Torah, they say, is rooted in those two commandments. All the positive commandments in the Torah are rooted in I am. Once you hear that I am of God, then you'll want to do the mitzvot. All the negative commandments are rooted in lo ta'aseh lecha, worship nothing else as a God. That's all you have to know. Why do they say that? Because a verse in Deuteronomy before Moses' death says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moses commanded us the Torah. Did Moses command it or God command it? It says Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moses commanded us the Torah. You take the word Torah, add up the numerical equivalent of the letters, gematria, it comes to 611. Torah is Taf Resh Vav Hey is 611. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moses commanded us 611 commandments. The other two, I am the Lord your God, and worship nothing else, those we really heard from God. That's what counts.
I want you to drop that on someone at lunch.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.